Welcome to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. Republican lawmakers have voted to direct Utah to ignore the Biden administration's Title IX protections for trans students. Senator Mike Lee says that plans to build more roads on public lands will help disabled Americans. Disabled hikers disagree. And are parking lots holding back affordable housing? Joining me on the program today are Salt Lake Tribune State Watch reporter Emily Anderson-Stern. Emily, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
Thank you. Open Lands reporter Anastasia Hufham is with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. And Innovation Lab reporter Sofia Jeremias is with us. Thanks, Sofia.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Good to have you with us. News columnist Robert Gerke not able to join us today, hopefully next time around. We'll start with Emily Anderson-Stern. And the headline, of course, Republican lawmakers have voted to direct Utah to ignore the Biden administration's Title IX protections for trans students. And Emily, this is the first instance of attempting to use a very new law. Tell us, I guess, what the legislature did in the session in the wintertime.
Yeah, in January, the legislature passed a law called the Utah Constitutional Sovereignty Act. That law essentially created a process by which the legislature gave themselves the power to vote to ignore essentially federal laws and regulations, and then hand that directive down to other state entities to ignore federal rules if those come in conflict with previously passed state laws.
Now, normally, quote unquote, I guess the state would sue. Have they sued over this?
Yeah, the Utah's currently in a lawsuit over new Title IX rules from the Department of Education under President Joe Biden's administration. And, you know, it comes after multiple consecutive years in which Utah has passed legislation that imposes restrictions on the transgender community. These particular Title IX rules would expand the protections under Title IX to transgender students, and would also, give extra protections for people who are pregnant in schools.
So the sponsor of the I guess the latest trans bill, Representative Birkeland, was pretty transparent, I think, in at least the reason she wants to implement this opposition.
Right. She said that she saw the new Title IX rules as giving people an excuse to ignore state laws. So, that's how she characterized the new rules. And she said that, she wanted to use these resolutions essentially to guarantee that state laws that have been passed would be enforced in schools. And, to clarify, Representative Birkeland, she introduced a bill earlier this year that passed that's essentially a ban on transgender people using bathrooms and locker rooms that align with their gender identity. And what that looks like in public schools is that students who are transgender can't use the restroom that aligns with their gender identity. And instead, schools have to make, what is called in our bill a privacy plan for those students. So that bill passed. It was immediately became law. And now she's wanting to make sure that, when these new Title IX rules are implemented August 1st, that they don't do anything to, I guess, get rid of that law in public schools.
So talk a little bit more about timing here. These rules go into effect August 1st. I guess many states have sued. I guess a couple of judges have already ruled, but not in the case where Utah's a party, I guess.
Right. And so these rules, a lot of it comes down to it. The rules would offer more protections against discrimination and harassment for when it comes to gender identity and sexual orientation. So, you couldn't have these laws where you restrict transgender people from using the bathroom that aligns with their gender identity. You couldn't have, you know, students, you couldn't have rules that require people to, use these students' correct gender pronouns. And those are some of the things that lawmakers are taking issues with. So, you know, Utah joined a lawsuit against the rules, trying to stop them from being implemented. And we haven't heard, those as part of the case, a judge hasn't blocked the implementation of the rules. But there are 26 GOP-led states that have also sued over the rules. And so, in all of these lawsuits, it's multiple states grouped together. But in two of them, two federal judges have blocked the rules, meaning that come August 1st, when the next school year starts, these rules will be on hold in 10 states.
So Republicans, by and large, are saying that the state law should prevail here against the Department of Education on the federal level. There were protesters there, right? What are they saying, and what are Democrats saying?
Yeah, there were around 100 protesters who showed up, and as long as the House came together to start debating the bills, you could hear them chanting outside to vote no on these resolutions. What it ultimately comes down to in there is how the state, sees its transgender students, and whether it's willing to offer them some of these protections that the federal government is, outlining and saying should be offered in schools that receive federal funding. The state is saying, well, hey, Utah states have the right to make laws about education, and when the federal government tries to use its funding to make the state enforce different rules, legislators are arguing that they have the right not to listen to those rules under the anti-commandeering doctrine of the 10th Amendment, which essentially prevents the federal government from requiring states to enforce its regulations if those conflict with the state's reserved powers, which lawmakers are saying here is education. But of course, the federal government provides a lot of funding for Utah schools, and that generally gives them the right to say how those institutions are run to some extent, and whether it will continue to give that money. So if certain conditions, if the federal laws aren't being followed, then the agency has the ability to withhold some of those funds. The Department of Education does. You saw threats around that back in the 1950s and 60s after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that public schools couldn't be segregated. And you saw the federal government threatening to pull its funding for public schools in southern states. And it eventually was effective in getting some of those schools to integrate.
I believe the Utah State Board of Education is, I guess they're trying to parse out how big of a threat this is, right? Whether funds might be pulled by the feds.
Yeah, and the State Board of Education seemed to think that there wasn't a huge risk of funds being lost. But that's what a spokesperson told us as we were reporting on this. But, I think it's also telling that the Board of Education earlier this month, when it requested that the legislature look into how the Utah Constitutional Sovereignty Act might impact um, these particular rule changes, it also asked the legislature to look into, quote, potential indemnification of public education agencies. So to look into if public education agencies get in trouble for ignoring these rules, how the legislature might back them up financially. The board also approved $50,000 to hire an attorney to look into how, state law aligns with Title IX, the new Title IX regulations, and also an additional $50,000 for an auditor to identify all of the federal funds that state schools are receiving, and analyze how much it would cost the state to comply with the new Title IX rules. So, the spokesperson for the state school board may say that they don't think that federal funds are at risk, but based on what the state school board is doing, it seems that they're thinking about that as a possibility.
Finally, Assembly, $2.3 billion is what the Department of Education sends to Utah for schools. I guess annually, or at least 2025. So what the estimate is. If some of that money is cut, where would that hit the most in Utah?
Right. And I mean, I'll say that if, the Department of Education does end up cutting funds because of states' lack of refusal to comply with new Title IX rules, it likely won't impact all of that $2.3 billion. But the schools that most rely on federal funding are the lowest income schools and the most rural schools. And so, you see school districts like the Ogden School District, where nearly all of its schools are categorized as serving students experiencing high rates of poverty, and approximately 15% of its draft budget for 2025 is made of federal funds. And in the San Juan School District in the southeast corner of the state, where you have a lot of where parts of it are pretty rural, it's one of just two school districts in the state that is majority students of color, and almost 22% of its draft budget for 2025 is made of federal funds, so more than 1/5 of its budget. So that would likely be a huge hit for school districts that are really relying on those funds if they were to lose them.
Post-finally, I said finally, but post-finally this, Emily, I was interested to read that is generally party line, right? These two resolutions. I think there was one Republican voted against the resolutions.
Right, and that was Senator Dan Thatcher from West Valley City. And Senator Thatcher's, pretty much developed a reputation that when it comes to LGBTQ plus rights issues, that he votes to protect those rights, and he will vote against laws that he sees as violating those rights. And so almost every time when you see transgender rights or other LGBTQ plus rights come up in the legislature, you can generally expect Senator Thatcher to stand up and say that he opposes those measures and to vote with Democrats.
Well, thanks for telling us about this, Emily. Appreciate that.
Thanks for talking about it, Tom.
So you're listening to Behind the Headlines. We're going to head toward a break. I'll just a note here. Check out Emily's story on a vote in the Senate on IVF protections. That's a very interesting story. Senators Lee and Romney voted against that, accused the Democrats of fear-mongering. Democrats are trying to get this on on record in the U.S. Senate. Coming up following a break on Behind the Headlines, here's the headline. Senator Mike Lee says that plans to build more roads on public lands will help disabled Americans. Disabled hikers disagree. We'll be talking with Open Lands reporter Anastasia Hufham. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. We'll have more following this break. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. We turn next to Salt Lake Tribune Open Lands reporter Anastasia Hufham. Anastasia, thank you.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
Here's the headline. Plans to build more roads on public lands will help disabled Americans, Senator Mike Lee says. Disabled hikers disagree. So Senator Lee has introduced a bill. It's called the Outdoor Americans with Disabilities Act. What would this do?
Yeah, so basically what this act would do is make the BLM, so the Bureau of Land Management, and the U.S. Forest Service develop and update their travel management plans for public lands. And a travel management plan is essentially just tells you where you can and can't go on public lands, what roads are open, what roads are closed, which roads might be open to hiking or might be open to another sort of, vehicle, and which ones are closed to motorized vehicles or open to motorized vehicles. So travel management plans really lay out all of those different rules so that people know where they can and can't go on public lands. And what this legislation would do is have these land management agencies make sure that there are enough roads to make public lands, quote, disability accessible, unquote. And what Lee defines that as in his legislation, his proposed legislation, is land with at least 2.5 miles of roads accessible to motorized or off-road vehicles per square mile. So basically that there's a lot of access for motorized vehicles on public lands. And he says, this is the reason he's sponsoring this legislation is because he feels that road closures, or when there isn't access for motorized vehicles on public lands, that disabled Americans, people who maybe can't get around by hiking or maybe have more trouble getting to these remote places, are missing out, and that's a discriminatory practice. So that is what that's what the legislation would do. And a lot of conservation groups who have historically supported road closures on public lands. You might remember, Tom, I think we've talked about this on the show before, but in September, the Bureau of Land Management closed about more than 300 miles of routes in the Labyrinth Canyon, Labyrinth Rims Gemini Bridges travel management area. That was in September. And conservation groups have said, hey, we really think this bill is a response to those road closures, because a lot of Utah Republicans have said that those road closures were an example of federal overreach, and that you should be able to drive a motorized vehicle on wherever you want to on public lands. So that is kind of what some conservation groups who say, no, these road closures are good. They protect habitats, they preserve ecosystems, they make sure to safeguard cultural sites. That's what they kind of see this bill as aiming at, is more like, hey, this is more about making sure we can preserve access for people who enjoy off-roading, less about disabled Americans. And when I talked to a couple of disability advocates, they said they kind of felt the same way.
Expand on that, because that's who this would affect. That's who Senator Lee says he's trying to help. What are disabled folks saying?
Right. So I was able to talk to Siren Nagakiri, who's the founder and director of a nonprofit called Disabled Hikers. And that nonprofit is fully, led by disabled people and trying to promote access for disabled people to access the outdoors and be able to have the same experiences as other people when they are in the outdoors. And what they said was, and I'll quote them, that the bill was, quote, a blatant attempt to scapegoat disability as an excuse to build more roads. So what Nagakiri told me really was that their organization felt like Lee was just saying, hey, this is going to be great for disabled people, and this is exactly why we should build more roads and have more roads open on public lands. but they didn't feel like that was really in earnest. They pointed out that there are a lot of people who already oppose disabled access to public lands because it might result in the building of more roads. They quoted this idea that disabled Americans want to, quote, pave over the wilderness, and saying that's really not at all what disabled hikers want. They want to be able to access these beautiful areas that other people can access, but also, keep really these sensitive landscapes intact. So they were saying that this is really just not a genuine bill in the spirit of making sure that roads remain open for disabled people. They said it seems pretty clear that the group that this bill is kind of geared for is the off-roading community, who has really opposed these road closures.
You did talk to someone in the off-roading community, Blue Ribbon Coalition. I think they try to keep access open for off-road vehicles and such.
Right, absolutely. So the Blue Ribbon Coalition, along with a lot of other off-roading groups, has spoken out in favor of this bill, and said that Senator Lee is really, that the bill would really help increase access for disabled people on public lands. Blue Ribbon Coalition, along with other off-roading groups, has also challenged the Bureau of Land Management's closing of roads near Moab in court, saying that the decision to close these roads was arbitrary and capricious, that there wasn't really a need to close them, and that in closing them, the BLM is prioritizing certain groups of recreators, like people who enjoy going on the river or hikers, over groups that enjoy off-roading or other motorized activities. So it was made sense that they also supported this legislation. And what Ben Burr, who's the executive director of the Blue Ribbon Coalition, what he told me is that when he hears when the BLM closes roads on public lands, he hears from people that from disabled Americans that they feel discriminated against and ignored. So that was his comment on this legislation, and kind of why the Blue Ribbon Coalition threw its support behind it.
Now, the state and others who are challenging the BLM's road closures, they cite RS 2477, which is, I guess, famous in these circles, might be obscure to to many. What is RS 2477?
Yeah, it's a great question. It was certainly a bit obscure to me when I first started learning about it, but it is a 19th century law that essentially says that counties are allowed to build roads over public lands. And a lot of off-roading advocates and people who believe, elected officials who believe that in closing roads, the Bureau of Land Management is overstepping its federal powers. They believe that these roads need to stay open because of this law, and are legally need to stay open because of this law. So yes, that has been a common statute cited in these challenges against the BLM closing roads near Moab. And just kind of, I guess, a little update on where those challenges stand. We're in a bit of a waiting game right now. Off-roading groups have challenged the BLM's decision to close those roads in federal court, and that case is still pending. But while that case is pending, the roads that the BLM did close in September do remain closed. So I'm sure that we will have future updates on that, but I just wanted to give a little bit of an update so that people know kind of the status of that litigation.
As I understand it, the legislature, we heard in the first segment there from Emily Anderson Stern, a legislature is asserting that the state's will be imposed ahead of the feds' will. That wasn't the only instance here. In your story, you cite another bill passed, HB 471. What does this do?
Right. So that was a bill sponsored by Representative Phil Lyman from Blanding, who's also running for governor. Representative Lyman has had a long history with opposing federal road closures. In 2014, he rode an all-terrain vehicle through Recapture Canyon, and actually spent some time in jail because of that, because that was closed to motorized access. And he has said many times that he believes that the Bureau of Land Management closing roads, or the federal government closing roads on public lands, is an example of federal overreach, and that they shouldn't be able to do that. So he brought this legislation over the past meeting of the Utah legislature, HB 471, the Public Lands Possession Amendments, basically saying that if the federal government closes roads in Utah, the state and its counties can disregard those closures and not follow them if those closures have been made without due process, which Lyman goes on to define in the bill as, a more thorough vetting of road closures than he believes that the BLM or Forest Service or other federal agencies currently give road closures. So again, not really a surprise that Lyman brought this legislation during the past legislative session, but that bill was indeed signed into law in March by Governor Cox.
Finally, Senator Lee points to support for his bill from the group, the Trail Hero. What's the Trail Hero?
Sure. Yeah, that's another off-roading advocacy group. And when I talked to a spokesperson for Senator Lee, he said, this group really specializes in providing motorized access to the outdoors for people who have disabilities or people who are veterans and maybe can't get around as easily as they used to be able to, and other people who just require a little bit more assistance with mobility. So, when I asked the Lee office, hey, what kind of disability advocates have you heard from in response to this bill? That was who they pointed me towards. And I think it's worth flagging here that when I was talking to Secretary with Disabled Hikers, they said that, they, of course, that organization, its real mission is to promote accessibility for disabled people on public lands, not only on public lands, but in the outdoors in general. And they pointed to a couple of ways that are maybe better suited for that. Basically, offering access to track chairs, which are like motorized wheelchairs that can fit on some trails. And also, I thought this was interesting, in Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado, the national park actually offers these really kind of funky looking wheelchairs with balloon tires that you can use to go over the sand dunes. So there are, I think, some alternative ways to promote accessibility and make sure that disabled Americans can access these public lands and these natural wonders that other people are able to. And I think that the message I got from disabled hikers was that this bill really wasn't intended for actually doing that, but maybe had some other motivations.
Well, thanks for telling us about this. Very interesting. A real theme running through today's program. Anastasia, I wonder if you'd tell us just briefly about another story you published just this morning. The headline, Utah sues feds over a rule intended to strengthen public lands against climate change. Utah, I guess, is joining Wyoming in a lawsuit against the Department of Interior and the BLM. Tell us briefly about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're definitely right that there is a theme. I think we've seen through the legislature this year and also through other actions by other elected officials like our representatives in Congress and our governor, this really pushing back against what these representatives believe is federal overreach from the federal government. And so a recent example of this, just tell you a little bit of background about this lawsuit that was recently filed this week. The BLM published a public lands rule in April. And what that rule does is it basically says that conservation activities should be on equal footing with other activities on public lands. Other activities, usually I'm referring to commercial uses like mining and grazing and oil and gas and logging, for example. So the rule says conservation should be on par with those other uses. And it also creates these mitigation and restoration leases by which the BLM could lease out degraded public land to other entities who are interested in rehabilitating it. So the BLM came out with that rule in April, and it was really not a surprise, but Utah governor and also a couple of representatives, Representative Curtis specifically came out saying, hey, this rule is really going to threaten people's livelihoods. It's going to lock up land for conservation rather than for development, and that they didn't support it. So back in April, when that rule was announced, Governor Cox did say that the state intended to sue the federal government over this rule to make the BLM throw out the rule. And that's what we saw this past week on Tuesday. Utah and Wyoming together sued the Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Land Management about this rule, saying, hey, y'all did not do a proper review of the environmental impacts of this rule. And Utah in particular said this rule is really going to cause a big burden for our state agencies that end up having to follow it. So definitely, there's more that goes into it than that. Definitely read the story on the Salt Lake Tribune's website or, wherever you get your news to learn more about it. But yes, that lawsuit was filed on Tuesday.
All right, very good. Thanks for telling us about that. I'll just one parting shot on this. I was interested to read, I think, the state in its suit. BLM is charged with providing for multiple use, right? And they're saying conservation is not a use. So that it'll be interesting to see how that gets litigated. Anastasia Hufham, thank you so much.
Thanks, Tom.
We'll head toward a break here. You're listening to Behind the Headlines. The next headline up are parking lots holding back affordable housing. We'll be talking with Innovation Lab reporter Sofia Jeremias. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. More following this break. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. We turn next to Salt Lake Tribune Innovation Lab reporter Sofia Jeremias. Sofia, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
So, very interesting story. Utah Foundation is out with another report, and I think they hosted a kind of a roundtable on this. A previous report outlined the problems of affordable housing. This one, I think, was trying to outline some solutions. I'd like to start back with the problem. There were some stats here that just struck me from your story, Sofia. So ideally, if you're going to buy a house, it should cost no more than, 2 or 3 times your annual salary. But indications are that people just can't find that these days.
Yeah, I think anyone who does not own a home in Utah and is middle class, is very well aware of this problem. I think especially in Salt Lake County, it's pretty rare to see a home for sale for under $500,000, which is just really out of reach, I think, for the average worker here. And that has been a growing problem. I think it really accelerated during the pandemic and after the pandemic here in Utah. And, there's been some efforts, especially in Salt Lake, to build more apartments. And I think there's some indications that has been helping, at least like rents aren't going down necessarily, but sort of stabilizing. But that hasn't really been so much the case with home prices. I think it's still very, very out of reach for a lot of Utahns now. It's just not realistic to, buy a home that's 6 times your annual salary. And so I think the state is very interested in getting more people into homeownership, mostly because I think homeownership is like one of the few vehicles we have to save for retirement, to build equity. And so I think there's a lot of concern about what is going to happen for this generation, for actually the generation I'm part of in, 20, 30 years when they didn't ever get the chance to buy a home and now have very limited equity or life savings.
So there's I think a Salt Lake City councilwoman on this panel, Utah Foundation researcher John Salavarakis. I think the state's housing czar was on there as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Steve Waldron.
So Salavarakis says there's no silver bullet. It needs to be, I'm trying to search for a variety of solutions, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think in this report, which I really recommend people take a look at because it's pretty lengthy, and so there's more to it even than what's in this story. But there's a lot of different approaches, I think, from land use policies, and that's kind of where that headline came in. They mentioned it's not that we don't necessarily have enough land to build more homes, but maybe we could rethink the way that we are currently using it. But of course, like, if we wanted to turn more parking lots into homes for sale, we would also need a better transit and infrastructure system so that people would still have a way to get to work, to get to the grocery store, to do all of the things that we need to do on a daily basis. There's also, ways that the state could help people more immediately, and they have taken some efforts to do that, like the first-time home buyers program that Senate President Stuart Adams spearheaded, and that kind of puts money directly in home buyers' pockets to help bring down those costs. But I think even those kind of have limits without more structural changes, because even if you have like maybe $10,000 or $20,000, which is a lot of money to help with your down payment, if the house is $500,000 and you make $60,000 a year, like that's still not going to add up and work out for people.
And in your story, the panel talked about encouraging density. That's one solution, but that often sparks controversy. People don't like density, I guess, near them.
Yeah, I think this is becoming a very hot button issue here in Utah. I listed two examples just kind of more recently. I know there's been a lot of kind of consternation over the Sugar House high rise. Some people call it a skyscraper, although I think there's been a lot of reporting showing it's not actually a skyscraper. It wouldn't be that tall. And then another example is Ivory Homes has a sort of ADU project that they would like to build up in the avenues, and there's been a ton of backlash over that. And I think like there could also be specific reasons why a certain project doesn't make sense, but I also think, especially maybe in our more historic neighborhoods or neighborhoods with older homes, people get very upset if you talk about building apartments there.
I'm sorry to interrupt. ADUs, I had to look that up. You may have known about it before you went in, but what is an ADU?
Yeah, an ADU just stands for an accessory dwelling unit. So it's maybe just like a smaller building that can be on your property. People sometimes call them mother-in-law units or granny flats. Just think like a smaller little house that could be on your property, and maybe you have older relatives, or it's something that you might also rent out to someone as well.
So I guess we could look to empty buildings, repurpose empty buildings. I'm guessing there's some downsides there.
Yeah, this was actually a really interesting topic of that roundtable. There are, especially around Salt Lake City, there's a lot of buildings that are empty or kind of just falling apart, falling into disrepair. And, part of the reason may be that it's just sort of investors or maybe families holding onto a piece of property, waiting for the market to go even higher. And there was some discussion of whether or not cities might institute a tax to make holding on to these properties a little bit more painful, I guess, like a vacancy tax or something like that. But I think there's a little bit of uncertainty about whether or not cities could do that because of the Utah legislature and some of the ways that they generally prevent cities from instituting taxes.
So even apart from vacant buildings, some people have second or third homes that sit idle. So that would also fall under this. Government could make it painful for you financially to have it sit idle.
Yes. Yeah. Second homes or Airbnbs, those are another big portion of the, or not a big portion, but it is a significant portion. I think, the Utah Foundation found that roughly 110,000 units are vacant in Utah. So it's not going to solve the problem, but it definitely is a significant amount of homes in our state.
Now, the panel did talk about some solutions going to take years and years. This is a pretty acute problem. What are some solutions that could be implemented and have an effect I guess, right now?
Yeah, I think it's mostly those ones I talked about a little bit earlier, like first-time homebuyer programs. Another one that we are actually already seeing across the state is these community land trusts. They are it's a nonprofit or local government can buy a piece of land, and then people can only own the house on top of it. And generally there's some stipulations in place so that when that family sells it, there's kind of a limit to their equity, but it's a cheaper way to get into home ownership. Those are just a few programs that I think, if funded by the state, could make a more immediate impact. I think some of these other things, and I think a lot of the focus so far has been on how can we get developers to build more, but I don't think that always has the most immediate impact on middle-class Utahns.
Sofia, thanks for telling us about this. And check that out at sltrib.com. I'd like to move to another story of yours from this week, Sofia. A headline here is Utah's implementing water-saving programs statewide. I want to get this word out. Some of this can affect consumers, people listening here. But first, let's talk about HB 242, which would require secondary water suppliers to install meters by 2030. How's the state doing on that?
I think it is moving along, but it's also a very ambitious goal. We got an update earlier this week that almost 30,000 meters had been installed across the state so far, and that another 85,000 should be installed by the end of 2026. But just to put that into proportion, Weber and Davis counties alone have 150,000 secondary water connections. So they are making progress, but they have a lot of work to do.
If people don't know, secondary water is not the water you drink. It's, I guess, the water you water your lawn with, etc.
Yeah, it's basically untreated water, because it is pretty expensive to treat water to be safe enough for us to drink, to use in our food. This is water that, you would just use for your lawn, your garden, but it is still water being used nevertheless, and water that the state would also like Utahns to do a better job of conserving.
Now, there's some other programs. For example, you can get an incentive potentially to convert your landscape from lawn to a better water-wise situation.
Yeah, there's and I think there's actually even more programs through potentially your local city, but the Utah Water Savers program provides rebates to households that potentially swap their grass for more efficient landscaping. They also provide rebates to switch to water efficient toilets, and there's a few other programs that you could take advantage of if you're interested.
And in your story, you send people to utahwatersavers.com, utahwatersavers.com. So that's the place if you're interested in this. We'll have just a couple of minutes. Maybe let's go to a third story of yours, Sofia. Here's the headline: Utah lost 20% of its farmland. Will the state try to protect what's left? You have a discussion here on conservation easements. The very attractive environmental groups do this. I think the state's trying to incentivize this. Others oppose this. I know there's a representative from Jensen out near Vernal, in my neck of the woods, opposes this. Tell me briefly about just your minute or two version of this story.
Yeah, and I think this kind of relates to that first story we talked about, which is that, Utah's trying to build more homes. They are trying to boost supply and hoping that by boosting supply, the prices might come down a little bit. But there's also downsides and to the way we build. I think there's been a ton of loss of farmland. And I think I didn't grow up in Utah, but just chatting with people who did grow up here, it's very apparent how much farmland has been lost across these northern Utah communities. This story basically talks about how the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food would like to tap into some federal dollars to boost the state's efforts to put farmland into conservation easement. And when farmers do that, they get to hold the land. It's still their own land, but they agree to strip some of the development rights from that land. And I think there is I wouldn't say that the lawmakers are necessarily against it, but they are worried, as they are with pretty much any program, about taking on more federal dollars and what kinds of strings might be attached. Another issue with this too, I actually chatted with a farmer here in Salt Lake County, and she told me like the cost of her land is pretty significant. And so it's hard to imagine that, a $5 to $10 million appropriation could really, I guess, convince a significant portion of farmers to give up these development rights when they might, when each farm might, potentially bring in like $10 to $20 million.
Yeah, that's a dilemma that families are facing, right? Well, Sofia, thanks for telling us about this.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's time now for our underplayed stories of the week, and let's start with Emily Anderson Stern. What's your underplayed story of the week?
I'd like to highlight one from investigative reporter Jessica Miller that looks at the life coaching industry here and how it's unregulated and how that's impacted, negatively impacted a lot of Utahns.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, sltrib.com for that one. Anastasia Hufham, what's your underplayed story of the week?
I wanted to flag one from Grant Birmingham. It's an excerpt of the Open Lands newsletter that we send out. The Open Lands team sends out every 2 weeks. He interviewed an author who wrote about the collapse of the Colorado River system about 10 years ago. And, a decade later, we're dealing with really crippling mega drought and a lot of other issues on the river. And so it's a really interesting interview. Highly recommend giving that a read. The headline is "What Happens If We Break the Colorado River."
Yeah, he got to talk to Paolo Bacigalupi. The Water Knife was the novel. I got to interview him when the book came out. It was interesting to get an update of what he thinks. Check that out at sltrib.com. Sofia, Jeremias, what's your underplayed story of the week?
I really enjoyed a story from Peyton Harkins. The headline is "Salt Lake City Police Target Criminal Activity at the 999 Bike Ride." This is a popular kind of raucous ride that goes through Salt Lake City. And it was really interesting. Peyton went along on the ride. She talked with law enforcement about why they might be starting to target this criminal activity. And it's just a fun story and an interesting topic. So definitely recommend giving it a read.
sltrib.com for that one. I'll highlight just all the political reporting, specifically on the candidates. And as we move toward the end of the primary here that ends on Tuesday, SL Trib has a bunch of stuff. They're outlining candidates' issues on their views on the issues. So you can find those at sltrib.com as well. Well, you've been listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and Salt Lake Tribune. We've had with us Emily Anderson Stern. Thanks, Emily, for joining us.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Anastasia Hufham has been with us as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. And Sofia Jeremias has been with us. Thank you.
Thanks.
And thanks, everybody, for listening to Behind the Headlines. Hope you'll join us again next time. Thank you.